Welcome to Season 4 of Lawyers with Game. Today we're talking with the General Counsel of Talon Esports, Lloyd Meng, about the future of esports and video games on Web3 and blockchain. Stick around. Hi everyone and welcome to Lawyers with Game. I'm your host, Darius Gambino. I am first and foremost a lifelong gamer. I've played on just about every console from the original Atari to the Nintendo 64 to now the PlayStation 5. I'm also an intellectual property attorney with over 20 years of experience advising clients on issues related to patents, trademarks, and copyrights. I'm with the law firm of Saul, Ewing in Philadelphia, and you can find me on the PlayStation Network under gamertag EaglesFan71. With me today as my special guest is Lloyd Meng. Lloyd is General Counsel and Head of Web3 Growth at Talon Esports. Welcome, Lloyd.
Pleasure to be here.
If you like these videos, please like and subscribe so we can continue making them. And please keep in mind that this series is intended to be a general and very casual discussion of legal issues. It is not intended as actual legal advice. If you need actual legal advice, please reach out to us and we'll be happy to help you. So today we're going to be talking about Web3, particularly as it relates to video games. Lloyd is an expert in this area, but Lloyd, before we get into all that, I wanted to ask you about your path to your current role. You have spent most of your professional career working in Hong Kong. Can you talk a little bit about your path from law school to general counsel at Talon Esports?
Sure, yeah. I get asked this a lot, actually, and I think it's an interesting one. Before I get there, I wanted to say I love your disclaimer. I'm definitely going to steal that for future use, so that's great.
Great.
I went to law school in Hong Kong with the idea of, wanting to start my practice here. I think the major consideration, was sort of here you can do law school as an undergraduate degree, which sort of shaved off a number of years from university. And so I thought, why not? It'll be a great sort of first career. If I decide to pivot later on, that's fine. And then eventually, sort of found my way into a law firm working as a solicitor. So I know that in the US, there's no distinction, but here we sort of split up between solicitors and barristers. And I did my 4 rotations through banking, derivatives, litigation, and corporate. And sort of felt like I enjoyed corporate the most out of those 4 and really enjoyed just working on, broad-based commercial transactions and sort of getting exposure to a lot of different things. So I decided to qualify as an associate with our corporate team and then spent a couple of years working on corporate deals, mostly specifically in M&A. After that, I kind of took a bit of a break from the legal industry, I guess. I think during COVID especially, it was a particularly tough couple of years. We had the Hong Kong protests before that, and then we had COVID. So it was a lot of working from home. And I think, especially during COVID, I think when the work kind of shifted to being mostly online, I felt like our schedules were sort of such that, when your office was at home, you were always kind of online. And it was particularly aggressive, I think, around that time because a lot of companies were looking to sell. So M&A activity was actually particularly high. And so kind of when things started to open up, I was actually offered a secondment to one of our clients in Tokyo. And I kind of sat on that one and we were waiting for it for about 6 months. It didn't really pan out. And I was thinking, maybe it's a good time to just actually take a break because I was sort of feeling a bit burned out and sort of feeling like, it'd be nice to sort of take a break and sort of reflect on where I actually want to take my career in the long run. So I decided to do that. Around that time as well, a YouTube channel that I was running with my wife was doing quite well. And so we were really interested in exploring this creative avenue that we had built for ourselves. So we thought, why don't we take a bit of a break? We saved up a bit of money and, it sort of makes sense to sort of explore that a little bit and see where things might take us in the future. And then fast forward, I think about 1.5 years past that, I did a bit of independent consulting work with a number of clients that I had and sort of more on the business consultancy side as opposed to strictly legal. And one thing led to another. And then a buddy of mine who was actually working at Talon at the time reached out and said, hey, we're about to sign all these new players for Valorant. And we're interested in getting our contract template reviewed. Would you be interested in doing that? And I said, sure, I'd do that for free, because I kind of similar to you have been a lifelong gamer. And I was always thinking about trying to find a way into the gaming industry, but it just felt like something that was very difficult to do. I think when you're doing sort of corporate M&A on sort of, random industries that aren't really related, it's sort of difficult to imagine how you can get into that. And yeah, one thing led to another. I did that contract for them and sort of, I think they were quite happy with it. And then I started working with them on a more permanent basis on the legal side. And then I think about a week or two into that, they sort of realized that I had this background in crypto as well. So they thought, oh, actually, we have this Web3 business we're trying to grow out, but we want to be very careful and very deliberate with how we do it. And so would you be interested in leading that initiative as well? And I thought, sure, why not? I think it would be a cool way to pivot out of being strictly legal as well and doing a bit more on the BD side, which I thought was really cool.
So, Lloyd, you mentioned briefly your podcast with your wife. It's called Em and Lloyd. I want to thank you for coming on our small podcast because you have about 40,000 followers on YouTube. It's a really popular podcast where you talk about what it's like being a young lawyer. Can you talk about how that podcast came about, and what types of things that you're putting up there these days?
Sure. I mean, well, first of all, I'd like to say, it's a pleasure to be here. And I think, follower count is sort of quite trivial at the end of the day. I don't think it's really that big of a deal. I think at the end of the day, having interesting conversations and talking with people is something that I've always been interested in doing. So very much happy to be here. How we kind of got started, my wife and I, we were thinking about, how we could do something together. But from a business standpoint for quite a number of years, actually, because we were sort of just like, it would be really cool to work on something together. And I felt like, we danced around a lot of different ideas. But I think, as I'm sure, working in private practice sort of means that your schedule is sort of quite set a lot of the time. And it's a lot harder to commit your time to certain types of things. So I think a lot of brick and mortar businesses didn't really make sense to do. I think even sort of e-commerce stuff, we were sort of thinking, it'd be difficult to manage that on an ongoing basis. And then one day, I forget if it was me or her, but we sort of just were sitting around and we thought, hey, we both like consuming content on YouTube. Why don't we consider making content? And I think a spark just kind of lit between the both of us. We were just like, yeah, that'd be a really, really cool idea. And I think, to be honest, it took a lot of learning and a lot of practice, I guess, for us to figure out how that was going to work in practice. But really, we've settled on a really nice thing right now where, my wife, she's incredibly creative when it comes to visuals and aesthetics, whereas I'm much more of an audiophile and I really, really like tinkering with sound design. So we kind of have this really nice relationship where she does a lot of the filming and I do a lot of the sort of back-end edits and sort of the sound design for our videos. And I think collectively it kind of comes together to a pretty cool end product. But yeah, we started off at first a bit more on the legal side where we wanted to speak to young lawyers and sort of law school students as well who are interested in getting into the industry. Because I think we are in an industry that's notoriously opaque in a sense, because you don't really get to see what it's like to actually be in private practice before you kind of get in the doors and maybe do a summer internship or really take on a full-time job. So we wanted to, I guess, lower that veil a little bit and give people a genuine representation of what it was actually like. And I think at the same time, we had a lot of colleagues that were interested in sort of, I guess, how we were living our lives at the time, because notwithstanding the long hours we were working, we were interested in sort of, doing meal prep and sort of making sure that we went to the gym and sort of generally keeping a pretty balanced lifestyle, which for me also included playing video games. So I think a lot of it was sort of speaking to that and how we managed our time to make all those things happen.
Yeah, no, it's great. And that's probably, a reason why there's so much interest in watching it, is because it is kind of, you don't really know what it's like to be a working lawyer until you actually do it. Right. I think a lot of people glamorize it, based on movies or television or things like that. But yeah, so it's a really interesting series. So
appreciate
back to Talon for a minute. So so you did a collaboration with Paris Saint-Germain, which if a lot of people out there don't know, they've had some pretty great soccer players over the years, including Kylian Mbappe and Donnarumma, the famous goalie. And you did a collaboration with them called PSG Talon, which is an esports collaboration team. And you've been competing in League of Legends and dominating, and more recently in Rainbow Six Siege. So how did that collaboration come about, and what's in store for PSG Talon in the coming years?
Sure. So I guess it started a bit before my time, but because I followed esports, I kind of knew that PSG was interested in getting into the esports scene quite early, actually. I think for at least from the lens of a traditional sports club. They initially, I think, made their first splash into the esports scene with Dota 2, and that was with a different team which was called LGD. I think it was a Chinese team, and they worked with them for a number of years. And I think when they approached us, it was probably a similar situation where I think they were looking at basically, trying to get into esports and, expanding the repertoire of games that they're in. And so the first PSG Talon team was actually our League of Legends team, which is based out of Taiwan and Hong Kong. And I think that team, as you mentioned, has done really, really well. So as far as I'm aware, because we are sort of, working with them on more esports now, including our Rainbow Six team, it's one of those things where we kind of co-brand the team and give them exposure in the esports space while also being able to leverage the amazing IP that they have sort of built over several years with their PSG club, right? So I think it's a very nice collaboration that we have. I think obviously we're very happy to work with them, and I think they've been happy with the results that we've been delivering on the esports side as well. But yeah, definitely, I think just hats off to them for being very progressive and forward thinking, I think, and wanting to get into esports and sort of finding creative ways to work with teams in the space to do that.
Yeah, and tying that back to something very timely, we just had the Olympics finish up, and there was a tweet where Kevin Durant was outside of PSG's headquarters, and there was some mention of maybe him investing in the team. Right. I know you're an NBA fan, so did you see that? Yeah,
I didn't actually. No, it's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, it's. I think the interest in the U.S. in soccer in general is just keeps growing and growing, and I think it's growing with the professional athletes in the U.S. as well. People like Kevin Durant, so really interesting stuff going on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even just on a scale perspective, I think it's generally good for the esports industry as a whole. I think when we get that kind of credibility and legitimacy as well from established sports clubs, right? Because I mean, when we look at how established the sports industry is compared to esports, I mean, it's night and day, right? I think we're definitely getting there in terms of, our contracts are getting more sophisticated. I think people are learning how to do business better. But if you look at even just the magnitude of, sales, revenue, and sort of, what players get paid in traditional sports, it's completely night and day to esports, right? But I think, eventually I think that gap will close. Eventually, I think we're getting to a point where people are understanding and learning more and more about, sort of, I guess, the esports market and how big it can actually be. And it's funny because even, some of our operations guys, when we have a new sponsor sign with us, we'll take them to an event and we'll sort of show them around. They're like, wow, this is really cool. Like we didn't expect it to be this grand and the production value to be so high. And we're like, yeah, like you guys are investing in this, right? So this is what you're seeing, right? This is the whole market that you're trying to address. So I think it is still that eye-opening experience for people. But I think now, especially because the younger generation now is growing up with this at baseline, and didn't sort of have to wait until it became a thing. I think it becomes much more ingrained in people's way of lives and just the way that they kind of experience, I guess, gaming and content.
Yeah, and you're really at the forefront of it. I mean, I was at an esports conference recently, and a comment struck me, which was, if you want to see where esports in the US will be in 3 years, look at Europe. If you want to see where it will be in the next 5 years, look at Asia. So we're still trailing here in the US a little bit, but I definitely see the excitement coming back for live tournaments. So I hope that continues. I wanted to talk about Web3 gaming because that's kind of the primary topic of our episode today. Can you talk a bit about your experiences with Web3 gaming? And just as a setup for our audience, we're talking about video games that are played on the blockchain or have some element of blockchain technology to them, such as NFTs. Can you talk a little bit about your experiences with Web3?
Sure. I guess I'll start from the beginning of how I got into it. I mean, I remember it kind of like it was yesterday. It was when I first started, around the time I started working as a lawyer, actually. I got my first paycheck and sort of had some money in the bank, and I thought, oh, this is cool. Like, what can I, spend my money towards? And at the time, Dogecoin was a really big thing. So I thought, okay, I'll just put, $500 into my Binance account, and I'll just buy a little bit of crypto and see what happens. I turned that 500 into $2,000 in the span of about a day and a half, and I was like, wow, this is, this magic internet money thing is actually real. And it was just a really funny experience for me at the time because I was sitting in the office being like, man, that's the easiest $1,500 ever made, So, but I think, past that, I kind of just, for me, whenever I experience something, I like to really get stuck into it. And I really like to sort of immerse myself in the experience. So because I was kind of, I guess, an outsider looking at, buying and selling a bit of crypto, I thought, okay, what's a way that I can do this and learn about the industry a little bit more without actually spending money? Because I also had that part of my brain that was like, well, this was really good and I made a bit of money here, but at the same time, I don't expect this to be the norm, right? And I think that, rather than pay a very hefty tuition and losses to sort of really get myself, I guess, stuck into the space, it was more a question of how can I learn a lot. So I had a couple of friends that were really into NFTs at the time, and I spoke to them and I said, "Hey, how do I get involved?" And they said, "Well, the first thing is you need to make a Twitter account, now known as X, as we know."
Yeah.
And I was like, "Okay, cool. Like, I'll get on that." So I got on X, and then after that, it was like, "Yeah, here are all these Discord communities you need to join because this is where all the action happens." And I thought, "Okay, cool. I'll do that as well." So I got in all these Discord communities, and I think one thing led to another, and I started researching a lot more in terms of NFTs and crypto, and sort of started sharing some of my opinions, and that started picking up a little bit of traction, especially with a couple of the communities that I was sort of involved in. And eventually I thought, okay, cool, like this is nice. I think I have a skill set here, I have a perspective that I'm actually able to offer people that is actually giving them some value, so I want to continue doing that. And it just became a thing where I guess I found opportunities where I could share that insight and sort of try to be involved. And I think one thing led to another, and because the space was so nascent so early, I just got a lot of opportunities to speak with very interesting people, speak with people that I thought had very visionary takes on where the space was going. And at the same time, it sort of kickstarted my mini podcast that I did that was more on the Web3 side, which I did kind of a bit as a hobby, but also, sort of reached a number of viewers, which I thought, was a sort of fun endeavor. That's currently on hiatus, unfortunately, but thinking of bringing it back at some point. But yeah, I think, and then, now I guess with respect to Web3, I would say that I am in an interesting position where I am pretty bullish on the technology, but I'm also incredibly bearish on certain aspects of how the market is currently playing out. I think in crypto, broadly speaking, taking a step back here, I think broadly speaking, there are three groups of people, right? And this is a very, very large generalization, but I'll qualify it. I think that there are people that are incredibly bullish on everything crypto. And I think that they believe that this is the future and that everything that happens on chain is going to be, we're so early and soon everything's going to be on chain, much like the internet. It's sort of like we had a very archaic system for getting online before, but now it's like, so easy and people don't even think about it and everyone's online. I think a lot of people see that for crypto too. And then I think there are the people who are incredibly bearish on crypto that just don't like anything crypto. They see that it has a crypto affiliation. They almost have a visceral kind of like negative response to be like, oh, I don't want to touch that because it has to do with crypto. And that I also understand. And then I think there's that third category of people where you're kind of in the middle, where you see the merits, you see where things could go, but you're also cautiously optimistic, right? Because you also see that the space right now has a number of things that need to be overcome before we really can actually attract a mainstream audience. And it's possible that we get there, but there's a lot of challenges that we face in sort of getting to that point, right? And I think I definitely find myself in that spot. I used to oscillate between the other two, and now definitely sort of more in the middle. So I think a lot of the business that we do in the Web3 space, which I'm sure we'll talk about, kind of balances both of those sentiments I have.
And my experience getting into it was similar, but from a different perspective. I've always loved card collecting. And so, when NBA Top Shot and things like that came out, that kind of drew me into the world of NFTs and blockchain and things like that. Then there were some games that involved, either card battling or card collecting or things like that. And so I got involved in some of those, learned on the fly about things like gas fees and, converting, USD to crypto and things like that. And, it's that's how you have to learn, I think. And that's how we have to get other, and I think it's a lot easier to learn now than it was when I learned. I think it's a lot easier for people to get into it now.
Totally. I mean, so you must have been around for the eras when we were paying, hundreds of dollars in gas fees, right? So, I mean, that was a crazy time. What a time to be alive, right? Wow.
For sure. Well, let's talk about you and I were together at the Game Developers Conference in San Francisco this past year. It was my first time at GDC, and I was really taken aback by the sheer number of exhibitors that had Web3 games. And I don't mean just games that involve NFTs. I mean games that are actually being played on a blockchain. Or have, other blockchain elements to them. One of the ones that you and I kind of stood around and watched together was a game called Shrapnel, which is a first-person shooter that basically, one of the aspects of it is it lets you own your own skins, right? The skins are NFTs on the chain, and you can kind of own them and move them around. And there's some other aspects to it. And they have their own crypto that's part of the game. So what kind of interested you most at GDC and in terms of like Web3 games and where they're headed?
I think the biggest thing for me was honestly just seeing the step function increase in the quality of games that we were seeing, right? Because I think, the whole crypto gaming narrative was kind of, I guess, kickstarted with very, very simplistic games that had interesting economy design, including stuff like, I think it was like Wolf Game was one, Axie was one of them. And, those were things that got people really bullish back in sort of 2020, 2021. And I think we kind of have moved into a different era almost of gaming now, where we're starting to see actually very high quality titles come out. And so again, kind of like a step function increase. And it's interesting because, we had that bear market slump in sort of 2022, early 2023. And I feel like it was a lot of the people that were raising money back when crypto was booming and sort of spent a lot of time, developing their games during the bear market that sort of came out with their products. And I was like, wow, this is like very interesting to me because truthfully, I think we haven't really figured out the extent of, how we can integrate the blockchain and NFTs really well into games. And I think different people have different ideas on this. As you mentioned, Shrapnel as an extraction shooter, they let you find items that you can then extract out and sort of own as NFTs, skins you own yourself and stuff. And I think that's definitely one of the more obvious and intuitive use cases. But I think in terms of something that's a really strong value proposition, there is then the question of, okay, well, what does that actually mean for the end user, right? Because for me, it's like on the Steam marketplace, if you're playing CSGO, you technically own your skins. I mean, you don't really own them in the sense of owning something on the blockchain, but you still have the right to buy, to sell, to trade, which I feel like is kind of like NFTs light, if you will. The big difference being that obviously they're all sort of really owned by Valve and subject to the terms and conditions on Steam, right? So I think there's a lot to be said about where we can go with all of this stuff. I'm not really terribly convinced yet that we figured out exactly what it's all going to look like at the end of the day. But for me, it's sort of a thing of the game quality is getting a lot better. And that to me is really interesting because it means that, okay, there are some serious people that are sticking around and trying to figure out how to make this work. And to me, that means that we're getting closer. You know what I mean?
I think that's the one thing that really was impressed upon me at GDC was just the quality of the games and the sheer number of them. And they're really, approaching or at the level of what we consider to be, AAA or, really high level games. So it's interesting to see where that's all going to go. And that's the other part of it that I wanted to ask you about was in terms of esports, right? Do you see for Talon as a team or PSG Talon, do you see any esports titles emerging out of the Web3 space that could be on par with games like League of Legends and Rainbow Six Siege in the coming years?
I think we're moving in that direction. I mean, I kind of like to tell this anecdote or little story, I guess, from time to time when people are too bearish, I guess, on the space. And it's sort of like, they expect like a big Ubisoft or Valve to come in and make a Web3 game. And I kind of say, well, if you kind of think about the genesis of the current meta that we have in gaming, which is, free to play multiplayer games, that was all started because a small indie company at the time, Riot Games, decided to come out with League of Legends and completely flip the script on its head, right? Because at the time, even for multiplayer games, you had to pay 20, 30, sometimes even 50 or $60 to buy a game, and then you'd be allowed to play it online. But, Riot kind of flipped the script and we're like, okay, well, why don't we just make this game free to play, entirely free to play, and we'll monetize it through skins. At the time, that had only really been done in mobile games and maybe some MMOs, but wasn't really something that people were looking at in terms of, a serious, high-quality multiplayer game that had the potential to be a huge esport. But, they proved everybody wrong. They showed the market that it was possible, and that became the industry standard. And now Riot is considered one of those massive, Ubisoft, Valve kind of level publishers and game developers. And I think it just sort of goes to show, for me, I think it's going to be a similar kind of story in the Web3 space. If someone figures it out, it's going to be a similar experience where I don't think it'll be necessarily one of the titans in the industry. I think it'll be a small publisher that really has nothing to lose that's going to figure something out. And maybe that has the potential to change the entire industry, right? But in terms of esports, I mean, I think it's tough to say, right? Because I think a lot of things need to come together before an esport is possible. And this is something that we communicate a lot to a lot of games that want to work with us. A lot of games are sort of looking to launch their product and they immediately want to start doing esports. And we kind of say to them, look, it's difficult to do this, right? Because if you're looking at the normal trajectory of how this stuff gets built out, first and foremost, you need a community and you need a player base before you can even consider esports. So we often talk to these guys about how do you do the marketing? How do you do the sort of user acquisition? How do you do the awareness campaigns to get gamers interested in your game enough so that they'll try it out and build those network effects of like, hey, I'm going to invite my friends to play, or I'm going to get, this group of guys to sort of like hop on and play a game with me, or I'm going to mobilize this community, because you need that to happen before you can even think about esports, right? And then I think once you kind of get that movement and get that organic fan base that comes in that's really interested in playing, then you can kind of scale it into, okay, cool. Like now we want to do esports as a way to market to our existing fan base, to sort of pull them back into the game, to give them content, to sort of keep them engaged in our ecosystem, while at the same time maybe attracting some people outside, right? I can say this from my own experience as well. I play Valorant a lot. It's one of my favorite games to play right now. And for me, it's always a thing where I'll take a break for a while because I get burned out from grinding ranked, or I just, really busy, or I'll, switch to playing a different game for a while. And then, a big tournament will come around and I'll be like, cool, I'm watching Valorant again, because the storylines are just so good. The sort of, the teams are, there's always something big happening. So you start to watch again and then it makes you want to play. Right. So I think it's a really, really good tool for mobilizing your existing community and getting them really interested in your game and wanting to play the game. But without that community there, it's really, really hard to get to that point. You know what I mean?
Let me ask you this about Valorant, because, I played it a while ago on PC and then it just came out on PlayStation 5. So I downloaded it and was messing around with it again. I've never been very good at it. So who should I be playing with? I mostly play with Sova, I guess.
Okay.
Who should I be playing with as like a starting out player that's like a good one to start out with?
I think Sova's pretty good. I think Sova's pretty good in the sense that, well, I think whatever you pick, it should be something that if you want to get better at the game, it's always better to stick with the same agent for a little while, because then you're not really thinking so much about the utility and you can just focus on learning the macro game and sort of getting your mechanics better. That's something that I learned from grinding Dota 2, actually. I sort of played 400 games with the same hero in a relatively short span of time, but that's what finally got me to actually be decent at the game that I've been playing for 12 plus years. But yeah, I think same with Valorant. I think sticking with one or two agents in the same sort of role is a really good way to learn it. And I think, Sova's really good. I think Sova's good for, playing around your team and sort of learning how to hit a site with your utility. So definitely one I like as well.
All right. I'll stick with them.
Yeah.
We have time for one more question today. So I wanted to ask you, what's on the horizon for you personally and for Talon over the coming year?
I think we're working on a lot of different verticals on the esports business, and I think we're still expanding our esports as much as possible. Just recently, we kind of announced our new CS2 team, which is a big initiative from us. We took a mostly Australian roster and are sort of actually having them boot camp in Europe. And the idea being that, iron sharpens iron. If you want to compete against the best, then you need to practice against the best, right? So we have them in EU right now doing a sort of major boot camp, and then they'll come back to Australia to play in the Oceania qualifiers for the next major, which is in Shanghai. And so we're constantly thinking about what we can do on the esports front to sort of build out those verticals. I would say more specifically on the Web3 side of the business, we're still in talks with a lot of games. I would say right now, especially because the market has been slower than it was over the last few months, it's actually a really, really good time for us to be speaking with projects and sort of looking at who's really serious about trying to, make a game that's actually good, right? Because one of our biggest qualifications for working with any of these projects is sort of like, well, sure, you have a token, sure, you have these blockchain integrations, but are you interested in the space just because you think that you can raise money? Or are you interested in the space because you think that you have a cool perspective on the technology that you think will actually enhance the experience of gamers like me, like the guys in our office, and sort of, like the people that you want us to help you reach, right? So I think that's the major thing for us at the moment. It's a lot of speaking to games and sort of doing play tests and stuff. And I would say that there's actually a number of games that we're looking at right now that I'm pretty excited about, that I think are in genres that I have historically very much enjoyed playing. So I'm quite excited to sort of like see what we can do with those guys for sure.
Great. Sounds really interesting. Well, that's all the time that we have for today. If you have any questions about any of the issues that we've raised, please drop them into the comments and we'll do our best to answer them without providing any real legal advice, of course. I want to thank Lloyd Meng, General Counsel and Head of Web3 Growth at Talon Esports, for coming on today. Thank you, Lloyd.
Thank you very much for having me.
And so we will see you next time on Lawyers with Game.